Hello everyone, today we talk about family history during the 14th and 15th century Tuscany. I think this is an interesting topic we never addressed, the history of family framed in social studies, how families transform over time, what are the factors that bring this. Naturally, in the past, as we will see, there were different models. Today we have basically nuclear families, and I think that this period in history is very important because in some ways it basically at least went into the direction of not just simply linearly, because there are a lot of back and forth in transformations. There is not a kind of progressive evolution, but at least it came close to us, to our own. The 14th and 15th century, especially the first one, being moment of crisis and subsequent stabilization, right? So a lot of changes took place. Recently, we made a couple of videos talking about all the kind of the demographics, the socio-economical changes, and especially the crisis of the 14th century and the Black Death brought in society. And so I think that these examples, we'll be talking essentially about Florence and Lucca in Tuscany, maybe Prato a little bit, just to show the passage from a more clanic to a more nuclear family and why this happened. So first of all, we should talk about the beginnings, right? Talking about the end of the 13th century, beginning of 14th, that were also moments of crisis, because the first crisis of the 14th century is perceived, in fact, from the very last decades of the 13th. Had brought in these Italian cities two important political and social changes. Basically, Italy had, especially communal Italy, had come from this moment of great expansion and growth, which had brought the people, the middle classes, let's say better, essentially the citizenry of the city proper, right? Cities were ruled by a commune, which was a very complex set of smaller guilds, fundamentally corporations, whatever you want to call them, with a general public organization that varied over time. There was a very shared view of politics. I don't know, imagine in Florence as if the government changed every 2 months, right? This was a very convenient way, essentially, to keep the various corporations actually in charge of their own private business. The government didn't particularly interfere in their affairs, but there was this idea that nobody was trusted at the government at the point they had to change it over and over again. There was this obsession, it was institutionalized, right? Of the creation of tyranny, which was a real thing. Florence, now we start from it because it's kind of it's the best documented city in general, not just in Tuscany, but I think legitimately in Italy and possibly also in Europe at that time, because it produced, in fact, this enormous documentation, mostly a product of the middle classes. So that's the reason why we know an amazing lot about this city. It had enormous trade traffics. It was by the beginning of the 14th century actually the richest city in the entire world, right? And therefore has produced a lot of documentation, a lot of even exterior, think about urbanism and art, right? So we can get actually a lot from it. It's a similar situation in the rest of Tuscany. These were essentially city republics, which experienced on some occasion as essentially a seigneurial rule, right? The presence of a tyrant, as it was called by the Tuscans, that, however, were short-lived. Like, this was actually a pretty functional solution in times of war, especially. There were cities that had kind of a continuity with this, thinking about Arezzo, for example. Other cities like Lucca and Pisa, for example, had substantial seigneurial parentheses, but eventually reversed back to popular government. But they were basically together. When we talk about popular government, we're talking still about an elite that is the citizenry elite. and therefore these consortees, if you want to call it in this way, that had kind of were segmented on their own. These were groups that produced knights, as they produced merchants or lawyers, and like that. They were evidently not like average workers at this point, because actually the Italian middle classes had solidly gentrified at this time. They were the ones that actually paid for the means of production and everything, for the textile industry, usually and especially in Tuscan, especially in Lucca, and they actually paid the peasantry to come to work in the city that was expanding. There were suburbs growing, city expanding in this regard, but those were kind of, the immigrants were the poorer people that worked for this citizenry, and they were part of the same thing. The city ruled at the center of a district, right? You don't find this in any other country. Essentially, the city takes over the countryside, takes over the district, differently from other areas where the countryside is ruled by the nobility. There was still a certain nobility that, however, was still part of the city in a way or another. And there was this obsession that one ruler, one nobleman, would take over the popular institutions, as they were called at that time, and establish, in fact, a monocratic regime, right? So there is a wave starting, well, this is typical of 13th century, and especially second half of 13th century Italy, partly also of the beginning of 14th century, where the so-called magnates, the tycoons, let's say, were expelled by the local legislation. This was not like ever an absolute thing. Like these magnates were actually families of the ancient nobility, as well as actually one of that had enriched very, very shortly before, right? The most important criterion here was simply, if they are too powerful, they're trying to make a coup d'etat, they should be expelled from the city. And in these groups, these were effectively clanic families, right? The idea of the corporation, of the guild here, especially in Italy, was rooted in the sense that they were all part of a single family that ruled its own business in the city and made it going on. This period, especially 14th century, is very important because especially Florence, and this is probably the best example, produced effectively a model of centralization that you don't find in other cities. There were cities that sometimes were even way more powerful. For example, from a military point of view, take Genoa, that had a kind of a maritime dominion, reached as far as the Black Sea. But it was all privatized, which means that these consortees or consortia, if you, depending on what you want to call them, were basically ruling privately in the absence of a strong public power. Florence is one of the first cities that effectively builds quite modern, let's say, structures from an institutional, but even literally infrastructural point of view. For example, prisons, right? Up to these times, prisons as such didn't quite exist like a place where you could keep people for an indeterminate period of time. Usually people either had their goods confiscated, whatever. They even the construction of the places of power, and the same city walls and many other even masterpieces of medieval art and architecture, like the cathedrals, were started here and they were incentivized by public authority, because it was a way actually to call more and more people to work there, to pay taxes, and therefore to make the city larger and richer, right? And Florence does pretty well. Like, Florence has many faults in this regard, because the popular government, let me tell you, is not dramatically effective, especially when you talk about war and the great lords of Lombardy, for example, were at this time quite ahead in creating what would become effectively kind of a regional state. Florence was still a provincial power at this point, which is ironic because you have literally the richest city in the world that, however, at the territorial level is not even a regional power. It doesn't extend power all over Tuscany. It has a great influence, definitely, on the other cities, especially the smaller ones in the southwest, etc. But it has to struggle a lot, and there are continuous wars that Florence can't say who wins or who loses at the end of the day, but because they were strategically kind of inconclusive. But for medieval standards were in general, but Florence is defeated on the battlefield many occasions, right? Especially by the Lucchese, the peasants. They were actually, especially Lucca was a smaller power, but nevertheless, with a seigneurial direction, was much more politically and military efficient than the popular governed Florence. So there were still, however, these major clans in the city, for which even the most important families of seigneurial Italy would emerge from. I mean, the Medici, for example, existed already at this point, were absolutely not even closely, close to become the power it would be in the 15th century, but were still there, and they were part of all these well-off groups that had their business had begun. This is typical of the Tuscan gentry. Let's say that they had begun relatively early to enrich themselves. Tuscany didn't have quite of an aristocratic tradition like in the Po Valley. These were ruling classes that had risen to power essentially in the last generations. They didn't have from the people, not from previous old nobilities, right? So some were naturally older than others. There were some families that were definitely also married into other very prestigious dynasties and lineages of the countryside that, however, at this point were in deep crisis, especially in Tuscany, because of the same expansion in Florentine Republic. So you have to imagine a very wide net of relations, as a matter of fact, that within the city itself were actually a universe on their own. We're talking about people that had first of all a lot of interests in common. So these interests were intertwined deeply in many ways. For example, from a professional point of view, matrimonial relations and also lifestyle, right? These gentries, well, albeit very popular in civic culture, they were actually very, very appreciative of the feudal culture as such. They were even the populars initially in, I don't know if you had told, in 12th century Italy were essentially just those who provided the infantry for the army. At this point, the people has actually managed to stratify at a point that it could actually produce even its own knights that, generally speaking, were essentially the same thing of the others, but in Tuscany, and especially in Florence, at least in those areas where there was a richer background, right, where the main activity wasn't much war as such, but trade, but mercantile activity. There was this cliche that these guys were becoming, as knights, basically ineffective. The infantries were actually solidly tough by this time. They were also declining in general. Italy will see soon the rise of mercenary companies over time that actually already existed at this point, but they hadn't kind of become a major feature. But that was the direction. And the idea is pretty simple. I mean, you have a freaking lot of money. You use that to rule a city in everything, including the military, which naturally you tend not to participate, but simply sending someone else to do war for you. There are usually mercenary professionals, increasingly also foreign knights, etc., and the district levies. That is the peasantry that makes the for the majority of the of the infantry, usually the bulk of the infantry. That, however, was not a great deal when recruited en masse so hastily sometimes. And there is all a military history here that would be very, very interesting to go in depth of, but this is just family history. I have to stick to that, but we will talk about it. By the way, if you go in the medieval Italy playlist, you'll find something on the rise of mercenary companies, on communal infantries, and we will definitely keep talking about this. But talking about these clans, naturally, you can think it a bit like the mob. Like the problem with the magnates had been, even in this kind of military and violent lifestyle, that bothered trade, because now, yeah, we should make an entire video actually explaining how communal society entered in crisis. I did that, right? So once again, search for it. But the important here is to understand that these were the richest people, hence, however, the best document, right? It was still a lot of social mobility, and it was a fairly shared one, as we were saying at the beginning of the video. So, say that we have a pretty good documentation on the interrelation within the interrelations within the system, and let's say that effectively these clans ruled the city. Like, they made justice on their own. They kept the order in the city. At the point though, they start clashing with each other, and some get fed up, and therefore some families, the ones of magnates, get expelled. This doesn't mean that it was necessarily a monetary criterion behind it, like it was an eminently political measurement, right? It was not a standardized, like everybody who is rich goes out. No, it didn't work like that at all. Simply, was thought, sometimes even legitimately, to be wanting to take over the city, as would happen, for example, with the Donati, right? They were expelled, sometimes even brutally. There are city battles, urban battles in the process that also mess up, as you understand, the economy, and that was the main problem, having a pacified system. The people actually were, I have a bit of a prejudice towards it, because in my opinion it was not very effective. Italy is effectively heading towards the Signory at this point, and that explains it all. But let's say where there is enough money, the people tends to stratify in a kind of aristocratic fashion at that point, so that it kind of compensates with its political inefficacy, typical of people who tend just to make money without considering the political problems whatsoever, and pretend that everything that the enemies out there, like hoax, do not fall on them, right? So actually Florence is a good example of an evolution in this regard. But this first wave of expulsions is actually very tough, and it goes on for like every once in a while. There is all a political history here we can't trace, but for example, in 1293, there are 147 magnates that are reckoned as such in Florence, and their segmentation was 74 were rural nobility. Noblemen that essentially lived in the district, and that still, of course, interfered with the city, but that were practically considered out of the system proper. 40 citizen nobles, right, and 33 who instead were part of the urban mercantile families, right? So this is a pretty good example of the heterogeneity in the segment and the social extraction from these people. And these are all powerful, they're all rich, but they come from different backgrounds, from different mindsets at the same time. There was a great contempt sometimes even between the same groups, like a typical rural feudal dynasty would look at this mercantile families from the city and say, what the hell are they? Like, these are not true noblemen. They're not. The first group was also much more militarized than the second. Vice versa, the mercantile classes now, they thought they were, as all the newly enriched people, who were the best of all, that they were kind of sophisticated or refined because they lived in the city, and that these guys from the countryside were rustics. But these, in fact, they hated each other, guys, at this point. But they were accommodated by the fact they were expelled, literally, by the city and by the system, and therefore, for this reason, they were basically rebels, right? There were other groups that with which the city negotiated. For example, there were many counts. For example, the Guidi counts were pretty important. A family in the Mugello area, or the Apennine, a dramatically important area strategically, because it was the connection between Florence and Bologna, hence from Tuscany to the Po Valley, and a massive amount of traffic passed through there. In fact, the Florentine Republic is expanding the northeast on one side, exactly to secure that area, building new castles or seizing them. But it's as if at this period there had been a kind of permanent civil war within the district and the surrounding cities and countryside that in turn triggered other warfare even between the cities, etc. Because the expelled groups were fundamentally always trying to come back in the city. Dante, for example, at this point was not in 1293. He was expelled later, but yeah, that's how it happened. He was a Guelph, and he had a white Guelph, which is a kind of hypocritical term for saying that it was actually a Ghibelline, right? Many people think Dante was a Guelph. He was actually a Ghibelline, and when he was expelled, for example, we don't actually know much about his life. We know much more, of course, more about his work as a literate, but he wandered around with these groups, even as a knight, as an actual fighter around these castles in the countryside, fighting here and there. Here is permanent warfare all around. Then eventually he will take refuge in the Veronese lordship of the La Scala, but it's another story. But just for saying that, when we talk about these figures, we're talking about actual people who were take Dante, who is known essentially just as a writer, as a poet in popular culture. He was everything. He was a politician. He was a magistrate. He was a knight. He fought in the first line of battle of Campaldino in 1289. He was a family of moneylenders. These guys were into the economy. He was an ambassador, right? And so you get here this multifaceted picture of the Italian, you can't say gentry at this point, or even nobility. Like it's the Dante's family weren't particularly wealthy, but they were substantially a well-off family. So they still had their own power. They were landowners, right? Which means that they simply had lots of peasants working for them. And that's the point. That's all about the land at this point, even if financial activities are quite important, but still the land is the core of everything. So there are these waves of expulsions, but what you see is that the unrest goes on in Florence throughout all the 14th century, right? And in fact, many families had even been obliged, for example, to change name, right? They had to change even the emblem of their family to give grants in money, right? To say, if you can dispose of this money, but if you betray this, if you try something wrong, you will confiscate this wealth. We're talking about families that had their entire houses and very often quarters as such actually razed to the ground, because these clans essentially lived within the same house towers. They were basically, imagine a typical medieval city being built with these narrow roads that were all arrived at the main squares of the city, and the whole thing was like a massive fortification. Like, of course, there were the spaces and the structures inhibited to the used to for living, but these were dominated by towers, by walls, by other fortifications, loaded with weaponry, with crossbow bolts, with old axes, shields, all these arsenals that really make you understand why there was all this concern, by the way, for the stability of the city as such. And the name here is very important, and it's interesting also to look at how, in fact, the family of belonging here was a matter of political, deployment. Like there were lots of groups here that entered, split. There were branches of the same family, were one against the other. When we talk about family, we're not talking about the nuclear family. We're talking about extended groups, like tens, hundreds of people, right, that were all under that name, that ensign, that emblem, but naturally had different interests, simply because they did different jobs, right? They had money invested in different places. So it's normal that this kind of alternation, we can say. In 1343, many of these families were also impoverished, so that 500 of them obtained actually to pass from the side of the people, right? So the 500 magnate families were so weakened now that they entered in the people as such, which doesn't mean that they were actually richer than them still, right? Or that had impoverished in the sense that there had been no other popular family that had ever been richer than them at all, right? It was really a political siding, which is a different thing. So in front of these heavy economical swings and alternation in political events, the only gluing factor from the members of a consorty seemed to be the management of the ecclesiastical patronates, right, which is also important because at this point the church is also being framed within the city control. So that was a fair, good investment, and it didn't bring too much of a, the increase of pretty controversial, let's say, subversive activities, right? And they made a lot of money through that as well, because naturally, even think about the mendicant orders, these were financed by certain families at the same time. A lot of there was the creation of clienteles. The general direction of this all, in spite of the expulsions of those who were considered to be the most dangerous, is still that the people as such will develop as a massive oligarchy of a very few corporations of merchants, and that will eventually monopolize the political life of the city. And that ruled, however, effectively the whole city. What we find in the 15th century with the Medici what actually happens is that this alleged republic is at one point taken over by just one group. That Medici family was so wealthy that basically it has surpassed the others, and it gets rid of them at the same time. It always with the fiction of republicanism that was behind it traditionally in Florence, right? It's still important and meaningful, because this, of course, compared to other powers like the Milanese one, like Venice, it was very different. It would even it did create overall problems with Florence that wouldn't develop a very solid territorial domination over Tuscany that was, yes, progressively subdued, but still maintaining large degrees of autonomy. These are characteristics that will spark even certain cultural productions and a general more liberal orientation in the age, for example, of Enlightenment. In these areas were also ruled by the Habsburgs and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, etc. But the point I'm making here is that the importance of the group, of the single corporation, of the single central and extended family that effectively controls the whole society as such through his clientele. These people were literally given the job to people to leave, right? Think that objectively before the nation state, let's say, where you have a fully centralized government, and all the governments at the time were like this. Like if you look at medieval Europe, this is not like the mob. These are literally the mob. There was no other, even the monarchies, they effectively worked in that way. There was no other way to make it, right? And actually, these groups here, in the Italian cities, were building something kind of more centralized in this sense, more modern, more with a central power had a higher iron fist in certain internal affairs than others. Now it's complicated to extend that because that's institutional history, but just bear in mind that Florence would be the cradle of the Renaissance, even under that point of view, right? It's not just art, there is a lot of political, juridical theory, etc. But this is important in family history, in fact, not confuse the political history of the families with their actual familiar life. Right? It is true that the lineage appears divided, split among into politically counterposed factions, to put it in this way, in that the branches of the same family assume different surnames. This is also very interesting, right? So it really shows you that there were universes within universes in here. But this doesn't mean that the relation between the members of the consortee cease, nor that they disown the relations such. The Medici, for example, marry into both the Tornaquinci magnates that with the members of the same family that had passed to the people, that is the Tornabuoni and Popoleschi, for example. So you realize in here, even passing from the magnates to the people could bring to changing the name of the same family. This is very important because it's really changing. Like, of course, surnames have very different meaning at the time from the one we have today, right? A surname as such is literally the family name meant as you belong to this group that fundamentally you're into. Like today, it's just like a double name to say, okay, I'm more or less part of this family, but it's just like whether I inherited from my father. You know, you can't even change it from your mother, usually. But what's the point? Like it's a name like all the others. Here, it really made an enormous difference, and the belonging to the family was part of a political faction, really, that had concrete interests of which you were part of. Like the common people didn't have a surname. Now this is very important. There are certain areas, in fact, not surprisingly, that are the least economically developed, in which people didn't have surnames until the 19th century. Why, according to you? Because they didn't have basically the need to say they were part of something, because socially speaking, there wasn't much of development in that regard. So whether you're part of a family or not, it's just a matter of your personal feeling, but not of what it matters juridically. In fact, women, usually, that here were progressively had already actually been excluded from the management of most of the inheritance, actually, were, in fact, without a surname. Like, even in ancient Rome, women didn't have a surname as such because they didn't inherit. So they were juridically, like, it's just a person. Like, the family, of course, is important because it's as if the woman was property of the family, and therefore, whether she was named in a way or another didn't change much, because she was not representative as an active, juridical actor. Right, and that's very, very important in this regard, because the presence of certain names or not, or how they were used, can make you understand an enormous amount of stuff about society, right? And nicknames were another thing also, right? That is not to be, it's less important, of course, but doesn't have to be forgotten either, because sometimes within the same families, in fact, there were groups, as we've seen here, that took another direction and began to call themselves, for example, in another way. And this continuity, however, that doesn't mean that managing a general patronate in common, let's say, like these extended clanic families could be, mean that there were actually close relations between the members of the family. Right? Within these families, for example, wealth created an importance gap, an important difference. Like into these clans, there was the rich, powerful person and the person who was less in this regard, and had less weight, for that matter. And for example, it's easy sometimes to see that there are testamentary bequests, let's say, in order to give a dowry to the poor girls of the family, right? So there were girls here that had to marry. Their fathers weren't quite very powerful in the family, but they were still part of the broader family. So these women got their dowry from the bigger guys, like from of this extended family. The same went, for example, for aiding the less fortunate males, for example, by inserting them including them into the business of the family, so finding a job for them in the system, and even if they didn't have much of to give themselves in terms as associates, in terms of capital, right? So naturally, the whole thing is it's a big clientele that tends to support each other, and naturally, the larger it is, and the more powerful it tends to be. Of course, it has to be wealthy as well, but that's exactly the point. That wealth attracts, makes this group sticking together, and sometimes this could mean even having lots of people who would even take arms for you in case of, I don't know, there is a major battle in the city. Well, the more people are from your side and have interest to remain to your side, the better it is, right? However, during the 14th century, there is really the big crisis of the mid-century, chiefly, where you see essentially the weakening of the familial ties. And this is due probably to economical changes, and also by the events of the political life, which is especially evident in the mercantile consortia, let's say. The societies that were once managed by the members of a single family leave space to new associates that are not necessarily married into them. So this is particularly meaningful for the merchants, because it makes you understand that these groups were becoming, thanks to the financial expansions, like kind of much more, capitalistic minded, and therefore, okay, I associate just with people that make me improve my quality of life. So if I make money on my own, why should I share with others? This is very important, right? This probably goes in parallel also with a general social certification. This is the proof of itself, right? If these merchants sometimes were also just cumulators, right? They had increasing reserves of money. They lent, so they started to expand directions that before the original families were not seeing, because those were essentially archaic clans that were mostly about war, really. Like, there were actually always merchants and even jurists, for example. But the idea is that when society was simpler, generally these people were mostly concerned about the city and maybe the surrounding countryside. Yes, maybe some long-range trade in some ways, but it was much more local. It had to do with really being in the city, in the first place and maintaining that power there, right? So when the thing becomes the interests become of continental scale through banking, etc. Well, this thing doesn't make much sense anymore. Basically, you have a financial empire on your own, and yeah, you can have a lot of people who are associated to you, but not necessarily from this ancient um, familial background. So the clanic family at this point appears to be cited by certain affiliates that were recorded, for example, even in the local quarter of the city where they resided, or also in the rural commune where they had their own properties, right? This is interesting because it shows you a phenomenon that had always remained there, telling the truth, that all these very powerful family throughout the centuries had always relied, even when they were effectively urbanized, so they had all these palaces and towers and quarters in the city. Also, on the surrounding countryside, labor and even kind of military force. This is fascinating because if you look at the distribution of property in the Italian districts, you see that the city was generally in the middle of the district, and every slice of the city had basically properties in the direction in which this side of the city expanded in the countryside. So there were even logistical problems with it. I mean, we're talking about a lot of people, right? Medieval cities were dramatically overcrowded compared, for example, to ancient ones, because production was generally higher, more concentrated. These areas were leaving an unprecedented level of urban development in terms of economical dynamism, agricultural production, and there was naturally a very privatized culture that made these groups relying heavily on every element of society. It was kind of from their side, even outside the city walls. So the landed assets are very important, and from the second half of the 14th century, there would be an ever larger investment in that direction, especially after the failure of the major banks, especially in Tuscany, that had suffered major blows at that point. And so the risk is coming back on the land. And this is kind of naturally a more, it's a much more consistent asset than the financial one, in the sense that, of course, financially speaking, these families tend to be not necessarily poor in absolute terms, but it's because basically they have become larger, right? Much more like the major traffic of money circulated before the crisis, right? After the crisis, you have maybe people who individually have much more money than anyone had ever had before, but that's because they have overwhelmed the rest of the people. And part of the reason is that, in fact, after the crisis, after the Black Death, and all the massive changes that this had entailed, many people had invested in massive amounts of lands, and had they had basically taken away the means of production from our communities and simply controlled them, without any hope to for these people to reacquire them in some way. There is a crystallization. The ancien regime happens at that point, and the countryside loses badly in this process, right? There is a sort of coming back of certain elites, the same magnates that at one point are reinstated in the cities, but in terms of quantity of wealth owned, there is no comparison. Like the peasantry goes under heavily, as well as the salaried workers in the city. There is a major collapse at one point of many of these, a substantial part of this system, but those who fall, say, on their foot are chiefly those who already have a lot of money and that at this point are able to make even more. That's how groups like the Medici, for example, emerged. But they were terribly skilled, so it's not just that problem. And that case specifically shows you, especially considering the rest of wealth that was owned in the rest of Florence, that was a kind of an exception, right? It could even as well go in a different way theoretically. Let's say that the 14th century, as we have seen in those videos we were talking about before, is marked by a continuous series of wars, of famines, and of pestilences. And there are these long years of bad harvests caused by bad weather, and there is also the overexpansion of the frontiers of certain city-states, continuous warfare that has sucked into all the resources. Certain territories are literally exhausted. Like, an impression you get from Italy, even before the Black Death, actually, is that by the 30s and the 40s of the 14th century, this system had cooled down. This is an impression you get actually even in northern France. If you look in France in general, in other systems, even Germany undergoes a massive crisis at this point. And that's also why you find all of those mercenary knights reversing in Italy at that point, because Italy still had kind of a substantial amount of money still. And it's impressive in many ways how this system actually responds to the crisis. Like, Italy doesn't fall into further chaos like it had kind of at the beginning of this point, like a city-state on one against another, but it basically evolves into the regional state. We made some videos about that, and that's very meaningful. It happens also elsewhere, let's be honest, and it's often overlooked, especially if you look at Germany. Germany is often credited, like, at one point, like, yeah, the Hohenstaufen extinguished, and therefore, like, everything was lost, everything fragments. Well, it was largely already fragmented in some ways, especially in certain areas, specifically of Germany. But there are certain principalities that tend to concentrate, and to even aristocratize society. Like, there are similar processes here across all Europe, like the idea that the peasantry goes down at the end of the day. Even look at the Jacquerie in France, right? Yeah, that's a massive revolt. Such things will go on. They will lose it. We also talked a lot on Schwerpunkt about the defeat of the European peasantry in the 14th, 15th century, or the 16th. Well, it depends where you look, but complexly, it's deeply felt, right? And this speaks, especially for, in this case, we're talking about Italy. It's evident that for the efficiency of these systems, of these communal regimes, that at the end of the day surpassed the weakness that was proper of the popular classes to get into kind of an aristocratic regime, usually seigneury, or however an oligarchy, like it's the case of Florence. At the end of the day, it's kind of similar, right? Okay, politically, institutionally, it's kind of very different, but from a social point of view, not so much, after all. So we know that Tuscany suffered heavily from the pestilence, from the Black Death, and there are certain areas in which even half of the population is wiped out, and this naturally has a great impact on the familiar structures, right? So it's obvious that the passings for the pestilences and poor nutrition brought with them, if not the extinction, certainly of the dissolution of the families that had been extenuated, also economically speaking, by the fiscal pressure that imposed by the governments, that at this point were, as we have seen, committed in this work of a large work of territorial conquest, and to which the population answered in certain cases also with a strong mobility towards surrounding areas, especially the ones that were kind of fiscally generous, because towards the foreign immigrants, because they needed labor force. Consider that yeah, in that there was a temporary mobility. We're talking sometimes even just about 5-10 years, which was the time of the actual tax exemptions, and this brought naturally to families even to go live in places, in different places, to circulate, to create new familial ties, but also to come back in certain cases that anyhow produced this scission of familial nuclei, and that characterizes this kind of also transfer of simple conjugal families and of many singles as well, right? So people were searching literally for a new future somewhere else, or at least to have an opportunity to work temporarily, because locally there was evidently not much to to enjoy. And it's a tough problem. Like, there are entire areas that are devastated by war. Like, it's not. There are cities who really get emptied of all their economical fluidity. That at the beginning of this period, like, were some of the wealthiest cities around, and that at the end of the day get depleted. And this is fascinating because in certain cases, let's say, it's exactly those who had become richer the fastest that had also not stabilized particularly from a political point of view, and therefore get more easily swallowed by the major seigneuries that sometimes had started from much more humble centers, and that instead managed to take over these communes, and simply turn, making them part of the collection of cities that they were doing, like step after step, conquering one after the other. So you can perceive really that rarely, by the way, these cities were like conquered in one shot. When you look at this world, you have to realize that, as we were saying before, warfare is continuous. Like, you don't say, oh well, now we live for 30 years, one year there will be a war. No, it's like war is there, like a year yes, another no, and that's how it remains for forever. And a lot of aftershocks from other situations, and the fact that these cities were all part of a truly international system. The cities weren't clashing just for provincial causes that were sometimes the most important, but these guys were tied to the whole international system. They were, in many cases, the same people who actually financed the major warfare, the major wars that were going on. For example, between England and France, they were all completely into all of this stuff. So the system got seriously destabilized in the mid 14th century, and everybody paid for this, one way or another. Like, there is not like the winning horse and the other. Like, yeah, the risk was more likely, but at a social level, there is an important resizing of relations of wealth distribution, and it's felt, right? It's deeply felt. For example, also city and countryside at this point see the triumph in the 14th century of a numerically reduced family, right? That, however, still maintain a kind of a complex structure, though, because there were couples, for example, with children in a single parent at that point, or maybe some alive nephew and uncles that welcomed in the house their brothers and sisters-in-law and their nephews and brothers that didn't that have difficulties actually to separate, because sometimes they remained alone and have been living there supporting each other. So there's a sharp inversion compared to the opening of the century, when, for example, in 1331-32, among the 5,853 families of the Lucchese 6 miles, it was this area, predominated neatly the conjugal family. 73.5% in the simple kind of picture, and in 12.2% in the enlarged extended model, let's say. So the family seems to react to demographic collapse at one point with a familiar solidarity that was previously unknown, right? There is the idea that really the family nucleus here is very important, because it's effectively, in certain cases, the only familial relation that has remained. And it seems that this also makes marriages pretty earlier than before, and also more generalized. And this was partly aimed at also remaining kind of closer together, also from a generational point of view, to maintain the patrimony, the property kind of closer. And it's probably a mistake to look at these changes of the family, thinking that this brought, for example, to a different successory law, or that the rules of emancipation of the merchants, that means basically those sons that needed to start kind of a business on their own at a certain age before their fathers passed, right? And this remains largely the same. There is just one change that instead is important, is about the rules of transmission of the landed assets in the case of classical emancipation. That is the one that happened at 25 years of age. So basically, at the beginning of the 14th century, an emancipated son had the right to receive a quota of the patrimony that was equal to the half, subdivided according to the number of the brothers, right? So it's a half of your inheritance, your father's inheritance, according to your quota split among all the sibling, the male, actually, your brothers. So this quota was progressively reduced over time. And it seems that arrived at the mid-15th century, an emancipated son didn't have any right anymore to every kind of anticipation of inheritance whatsoever. This is very meaningful, because it brings basically, like, if at the beginning of the 14th century the sons tended to get married as soon as they came of age and to start a family on their own, a century after, they tended to belate the marriage, and once they were conjugated, they remained in the father's house because they didn't dispose of a property on their own. These are massive changes, right? And it's from here that, also to kind of fill the vacuum left by the demographic crisis, there were these reiterated duties, impositions, let's say, to get married for the adult males. They were imposed, in fact, by the same communal governments that were concerned about the fact that they would essentially lose their demographic strength at that point if people got married so late. And at that point, it's kind of even much more important now, because everything was much less technological, so the actual labor force was an important thing. Like, much of a pre-industrial society's strength is also objectively how many people you have, right? And how much they work and they're interested in expanding, etc. So there were policies in this direction. It's also evident that this new family was a family tendentially characterized by an enlargement, as such, because more people begin to try to stick together once again. It can even be multiple nuclei together, kind of complex, right? But never fully um, realized, however, before the first half of the 15th century, because it seems that the plague, this cyclical pestilences, prevented actually for this to arrive at the fulfillment up to that point, before that point. So the process, which is evident in the Lucchese district, especially between 1331 and 1331 further to and 1411-13, there's been studied in this regard, is also observable in Prato, for example. This is another Tuscan city between 1371 and 1427, that is accompanied by the lowering of the marriage age for women. This is also known from the real estate registry of 1427-29, that gives us this picture, pretty precise one, of 59,770 families of Florentine Tuscany. Here, I'll say that a bit more than the half, like a 65%, are conjugal families, either simple or extended, and only 16% are the relics of families, of which in turn only like 18% are the ancient kind of Asiatic families with more nuclei, right? And of 13 of these, they are kind of vertically extended, which means that they were clienteles, effectively, like nuclei that controlled others, and only 5% horizontally. Now, what these numbers mean is that basically that massive clanic structure that had characterized Italy up to the beginning of the 14th century, basically at this point is almost collapsed, like it doesn't exist anymore. There is a great nuclearization, if we can call it like this, of families. There are naturally families that are very powerful in this regard, and don't think that the elite in this regard is kind of still not powerful. It's even more powerful, as we've seen, while all the others are kind of living on their own, because they don't need at that point this form of social protection deriving from the clan. Why? Because there is the big guy at the top who basically gives job to them, and they don't have to care about further social connection in this regard. Like, the city is ruled by those families. Everybody knows that those are powerful. They give you a job, and they pacify the country. They control the government, the military. Fine, I'm under it, and you understand immediately this is a modernization of society. Like we passed from a clanic model that is typical of kind of medieval Europe in many ways, and in this case maybe it was a bit particular because communal Italy is objectively a bit of an exception, but the concept is always the same, the greater extended thing. Then you get here to in less than 1 century after, and you have basically essentially nuclear families like we have today. And this is really important because it's really what happens also elsewhere, but in kind of different times, and that at one point we can also observe. But these numbers are particularly precious, right? Because it shows that after all, there is, as always, a change of from one side, these people were less politically free, but at the same time they were now free from this kind of continuous commitment that the clan required, where another was also risky in some ways. So society has reshaped itself in a kind of a more individualistic fashion, but still functional to that particular kind of centralization and verticalization of society. And don't think that this is because once again it's very close to it's heading towards the modern age in this regard. Um, so talking about women specifically, a last note. In this Tuscan society, women got all married, and usually very early, both in the city and in the countryside. And the widows also found pretty easily a second husband. Um, the men, on average, get married at 25 years old, but um, particularly belated seem to be the marriages for the citizens that have to make long years of apprenticeship. If artisans, for example, they have to accumulate a certain amount of capital if they are merchants, vice versa, the marriage appears to be more precocious among the males of the countryside. We're talking about sharecroppers or small owners, because the land necessitates of many young arms, right? So they had to get, as always, this is true in every rural context, like, children are more labor force, they have work in the country, and that shows you also the generally expansive phase that, in spite of all the crisis, is fundamentally there in the countryside, still pushing strongly and enriching the city, however. And there are lots of implication about this, because it also tells you that the system was in crisis, but it was able to recover immediately with a very different shape, but still requiring even more from the countryside on many occasions, albeit becoming socially more detached from it, in the sense that the citizens became ever more kind of gentry in that regard, and the peasantry just does, like, the rural production was expanded in some ways. So aside from this, yeah, I think this is more or less what I wanted to talk to you about today. And yeah, I think we can stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.